Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is Onkar Ghate. I'm joined again by Greg Salmieri and Agustina. This is webinar 3 or episode 3 of the series on political philosophy, Ayn Rand's political philosophy that we're embarking on. We've covered so far 2 of her seminal essays, Man's Rights, which was the first session, the nature of government, the second session. The next 2 sessions will be on, what I think of as the third of her seminal or the foundations, theoretical foundations of her political philosophy, the article, What is Capitalism? First part today, second part on Thursday. So we've got some interesting things to talk about today. Greg's wants to make a few points about how we're handling chat and so on. And then we'll give us an overview of the article to help situate us of what we're going to be talking about.
All right. Hi, everyone. And I see where our panelists are starting to populate, or rather our attendees, so people are showing up. Just wanted to say something about how we're using the various features. So we have the Q&A feature. If you want to ask something that's a question that's not necessarily immediately a response to what we're saying now, although it could be, put it in the Q&A feature. I will see it, and if I think it's something we can answer live as part of the session, I will click Answer Live, and we'll get to it eventually. I may well dismiss it, and if I dismiss it, that's not a, hold on, I'm just seeing that I'm not properly named here, changing my name. If I dismiss it, it's not necessarily that it's a bad question, it's just I can only fit so many on my screen and keep track of them at once, and it's something we can come back to later on the Facebook discussion. Okay, so that's the Q&A. There's also the chat feature in Zoom, and anything that's just a kind of stray thought you want to throw out, or a quick response to something we're saying live, just type in the chat feature. Augustina will be monitoring that, and she'll sort of be the voice of the chat feature to us as we go through this, because it usually goes by too fast for me or Onkar to monitor it. And then finally, raise your hand if there's something you want to ask a question or chat with us a little bit about, where you would be involved in an audio. And please only do that if you're in a position where you're, it's quiet where you are and you can talk. And what'll probably happen is that Augustina or one of us will write a message to you in the chat feature to get a sense of what it is you want to ask about. And then that'll give us a sense of when to take the question, where it best fits in the flow of what we want to discuss. All right, so that's just procedures for today. And I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit, just talking about the structure of this essay, because it's a much longer, or it's a longer piece anyway than the ones we've looked at before, and it's one we're covering over the course of 2 weeks. So I think of it as falling into basically 5 sections. The first section is, you can call it the state of the field of political economy. And it is the first page and a half or so of the document as it shows up in the version of this that's on Ayn Rand Campus that we've linked to. It's the first page and a half. And it's just an overview of the field of political economy and why it's in, from Rand's perspective, a poor state. Then you get, starting on page 2 with the phrase man's essential characteristic is his rational faculty, you get a section on the philosophical foundations of capitalism. And we're going to spend time talking about that today. Then you get the third main section is what I call the distinctive ethical theory presupposed by capitalism. That starts on page 3 with the practical justification of capitalism. And then you have a fourth and fifth section. Section 4 is the free market as the social application of the objective theory of value. This objective theory of value is the distinctive ethical theory that's behind capitalism. And section 5 is on why capitalism isn't understood and is being destroyed. And we're going to talk about sections 4 and 5 next time. And we're going to talk about the first 4 sections this time. Particularly about sections 2, 3, and 4, And I'll say a little bit more about how I break down those sections maybe when we come to them. But let's start in with section 1, which is on the state of the field of political economy, and over to Onkar for that.
Thanks. I think a good way into it is to think about the title of this essay, which is, "What is Capitalism?" And this was a major question, I think, in the 19th century, or going into the 19th century. And it's the way to think about the field of political economy. One of the questions we ask is, what do you think she's referring to when she's talking about political economy and the political economist? And I think what she's referring to is a group of thinkers that, from a later perspective, we might say that what they're doing is economics, and we have this idea of a specialized science of economics. But from the perspective of looking at it as what they're doing in their own world and how they're thinking about it, I think the way, or at least the way I think about it, and I suspect this is the way that Rand is thinking about it, is there's this new explosive growth in production, in trade, in wealth creation that is happening in the 18th and into the 19th centuries. It's part of the Industrial Revolution, but part of what is happening is it's clear to people, or it's clear to some thinkers, that what's emerging is a new social economic system. And how do we understand this new system? What are the principles that are governing it? How does it function? What are its laws? So when we talk about the law of supply and demand, for instance, that's being formulated and is partly being formulated to understand the functioning of this new system. So and what emerges, but I think it's important to get that it emerges not fully by conscious design. So I think the new form of American government is completely conscious. It's clear what they're doing. We're using the principle of individual rights. We're basing a constitution on this, a new form of government. It has to have checks and balances. All this is very consciously and deliberately thought out. But what is the system that then is going to emerges when you have this new form of government that's established on these principles? And some people had views about, well, we're going to see explosion of knowledge and production. But what exactly is going to emerge? Why? And how does one conceptualize it? It's sort of the interface of government, law, and economics. There's something new emerging of the combination of these three things, which was then called capitalism. But this is what they're trying to understand and figure out. And so the political economy, it's that intersection of politics, and in particularly, we have a new form of politics, a new form of governance, and economically, all kinds of new unprecedented things are happening. How do we understand, conceptualize this, work this out? And it was Steve wrote, political economy usually means something like classical economics from the 17th to late 19th century. Skipping a bit, I'm thinking of people like Malthus, Hume, Smith, Mill, Ricardo, Senior, up to Jevons. And I think certainly that's the way it's used. And if you think what these people are grappling with, at least insofar as what they're doing is political economy. I mean, Hume is a philosopher, Smith is, and he's doing, for instance, work straight on moral theory. But in this aspect, what they're trying to understand is how to think of this new political system that's emerging. And I would add a person not here, Marx. Marx is also doing this. And it's again from the perspective of government, the philosophical principles embedded in government, and the new economic relationships that are being created as a result of that. And I mean, we'll talk about this as we go through. Rand is criticizing it. It's that some of the basic principles and concepts that they're using to try to conceptualize the new system are wrong and are from the old world, and not taking fully seriously and fundamentally enough what is new here. And it has to be conceptualized on its own terms, not on the terms from the past, which has been overturned politically.
Yeah, I think it's important too to understand this contrast between the old and the new, and the need to do something radical and new. To think a little bit about Rand's understanding of history more broadly leading up to this point. So she has the idea that in the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of the works of the Greeks, in particular of Aristotle, or rather the Renaissance was based on the earlier reincorporation of Aristotelian thought into the Western mindset because of the works of Aquinas and others. We have this kind of gradual, or quick by historical standards, but incorporation into Europe's way of thinking of this Greek pro-reason, pro-life on earth mindset in the Renaissance and in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And this is what now gives rise to the founding of America, the Industrial Revolution, and all of the great events of the 19th century. But the Enlightenment way of thinking, the Enlightenment philosophy, is never really consistent. Maybe the best version of it is Locke as a philosopher. But Locke has all kinds of problems in Rand's view in his epistemology. He doesn't go far enough on a lot of points. The ethics is sort of vague and messy. And by the time of the 19th century, this has all been challenged by Kant and other thinkers. The defense of reason, or the kind of pro-reason attitude that was inherent in the Enlightenment, is by the time of the 19th century been undercut philosophically. And she talks about philosophy's disintegration in the 19th century and collapse in the 20th century. In the 20th century, she thinks there basically is no philosophy anymore. And as a result of this new field being formed, like political economy and the other she really stresses, is aesthetics, are left without the philosophical foundations they need to really develop a proper methodology and get off the ground. While in the meantime, the kind of political conditions created by the Enlightenment, namely a capitalist kind of social system, and the scientific knowledge created by the Enlightenment, is spurring in the 19th century this tremendous technological progress, this tremendous development in wealth. Life is getting better and better and better because of this Aristotelian heritage, so to speak, or Enlightenment heritage, but we lack the philosophical skills to understand and appreciate that. And so somewhere in the companion, I called Capitalism and Romanticism. Romanticism is the literary and artistic school that she thinks came out of this Enlightenment way of thinking, as Enlightenment orphans. They're things that were created, in her view, by the Enlightenment. They have the Enlightenment as what gives them their start and their heritage. But the way of thinking that's central to the Enlightenment is depleted and not there to kind of parent and raise them anymore. And so they're not well understood, they're not really sustainable. And she thinks that capitalism is dying for lack of being properly understood, and that this is why. And then the particular form that takes is the science that was founded to try to understand it is on premises that are alien to it, that are not involved in the kind of rethinking that needs to happen to understand it. Are we getting people commenting? We're not having any questions. So any more things we want to say? Well, maybe we should go on to talking about the tribal premise, which is the particular form this infestation of thought about capitalism with pre-capitalist culture takes.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before the seminar started this evening, and she's, I think, Ayn Rand is using tribalism, the tribal premise, as a near synonym for collectivism, and the outlook that's prominent in intellectual circles in the 19th century that places the collective or the group as the the unit of value, almost the unit of reality, and the individual as subordinate to that, both in his value significance and even in terms of sort of causal, the way causally things work, that one has to focus on the whole, and the individual is a cog in the machine from that perspective, and morally subordinate. But I think the focus for the tribal premise, she's thinking of it particularly of looking at a social system and thinking of it as the system, the interconnections, as that's the unit to focus on, and that it's both, and particularly or importantly, that it's causally that's the unit, so that wealth is a product of society, and there's a social surplus or social deficit, and that's how you have to think about, and then at the big components, and a few people commented on this in the Facebook discussion, which I think is right. It's like these very big components. There's land and labor and capital, and these are interconnecting. So, and what's completely lost, or at most sort of way in the background, is the individual and his functioning and his decision and his thoughts and his values and what his knowledge or his errors. All that is abstracted away from, because it's being considered as non-important, and in part causally, not just morally not important, but also causally not of importance if you're trying to understand how this system works. And she's objecting to that. So both on moral grounds and causally, that you cannot look at the system like this. And one of the comparisons she gives is this, it's something like, if you're thinking about medicine, your unit to focus on is not a hospital, that you're not going to understand causally the way to think of medicine and health and disease and so on, if your primary focus is on the hospital, and well, hospital has management and doctors and janitors and how do they interact. So that's just not what to look at if you're trying to get it causally right.
Yeah, or to the extent that that it is to be looked at, it's posterior to understanding there are patients, a patient and a doctor using his mind to deal with the patient. And then you think, well, how do we organize people along those lines? I see there's a question that came up in the chat. Agustina, do you want to raise that? Or?
Yes, Mark is asking, is political economy the best term to use today? If government should not have a role in people's belief systems, separation of church and state, and government should not have a role in trade other than to protect the individual, why is it useful to have a term like political economy? If not used very carefully, it appears to be an endorsement of a mixed economy.
I mean, I could say a word about that. I think it's a good term. It's a term that some camps or schools of thought are trying to revive. So, for instance, the public choice perspective in economics that starts with Buchanan and Tullock at the University of Virginia. And they think of themselves as in Madison's tradition. They revived the use of the term political economy. And I think it is good because it's the focus on government and law and what the relationship of that to economics. And there is a relationship. So it's to me, political economy, it does not mean mixed economy. It does not mean government directing the economy. It can mean that. So if one's thinking of different kinds of systems, a socialist or communist system one way it's put as a command economy. It's much more of a mixed economy. It's the government in charge of everything. Property essentially is socialized, so government owned, or private property is abolished. And that you're thinking of a political legal system and government functioning and what this does to production. And it essentially ends production. I mean, what you saw in communist Russia is they could not produce. And there's reasons why, and thinking of the government and its legal structure, of why individuals in such a system cannot produce. And what you're trying to understand in capitalism is why, given the government and legal system, why is production so incredibly abundant, growing? Why do you see the progress that you saw in the 19th century? And it's not, you can't just explain that by the law of supply and demand or something. You need this wider context, and they're focusing on that. And people like the public choice school is recognizing if there's not discussion of this, and that there can be different forms of government, different legal systems, so you're not going to be able to get out of a mixed economy, because a mixed economy is a corruption of law and of government. So I think it's a proper term. It's good that there's some renewed focus on this, and you should not think of it as synonymous as a mixed economy or advocating a mixed economy or something like that.
Yeah, this is, Felipe asked actually two questions relevant to this. One is, would Rand believe that economy, or I guess the economy, is epiphenomenal of political organization? And I think not. Something that's epiphenomenal is something that is, in effect, caused by something underlying it, but has no effect in and of itself. So there is some level at which things are causing one another, and there's something else that's caused by that underlying level, but that thing has no effect. It's an epiphenomenon, something that's apparent, but doesn't do any causal work in the world. And I think that's not right. I think she would say that economic systems are an effect of, different ways of economic organization are an effect of the political structure, and that they're made possible by the way a society is politically organized. But they then have effects. For one thing, capitalism had the effect of increasing life expectancy. I mean, not just the political system of capitalism, but then the fact that people were able to create corporations and finance things in long-term ways, and all the stuff that would be studied in economics about capitalism had the effect of greatly increasing life expectancy. That then has effects back on culture and then all sorts of things. So there's a causal process that goes in different directions, and freeing up. So yeah, I don't think it's an epiphenomenon, but I do think it's an effect. And Felipe also asks whether what we're saying here is the beginning of an epistemological argument for methodological individualism. And yeah, I guess you could say that, and that really takes us to the end of this first section on political economy, where she makes the argument that because a political economy is so on this tribal premise, they're so thinking of things this way, that they're not able to understand the economy at all. They're not able to understand what capitalism is at all. And what we need to do is start differently. We need to start by studying a man. And you can learn a lot about a society by studying man, human nature, but not a lot about human nature by studying society. And so there's that argument made, and then we get introduced into that's the kind of transition into section 2, where she discusses the foundational issues that underlie capitalism. Onkar, do you want to say anything about this methodological point more than you've said before?
Yeah, just a little bit more. And I'm not an expert on I've seen it used in different ways, methodological individualism. And I think that it's right, as you said, to think that there's a connection to what they're talking about and what she's talking about here. But I think, as will emerge now when we talk about the next section, it's important for her view that it's both moral, and you can put it moral and metaphysical individualism. So it's not just an issue of means, but also of ends. And there's uses of methodological individualism that are supposed to be neutral on what the ends are. And I don't think she thinks of that. That's not her view, and I don't think she thinks that's a legitimate way of looking at things.
Fair enough. So We're moving then to the foundational issues. If we look at, this is what I called section 2 of the piece. It begins with man's essential characteristic is his rational faculty. Man's mind is his basic means of survival, his only means of gaining knowledge. And I thought I'd maybe start by giving a kind of just overview of the structure now of this section, what I'm calling section 2 on the philosophical foundations of capitalism. So we begin with a discussion of reason as man's essential characteristic. This leads to a discussion of freedom as a survival requirement for human beings, and to then individual rights as the social recognition of man's nature. Then we get a discussion of capitalism as the rights-respecting system, which includes a definition of capitalism, and we'll want to talk about that definition, and then a sort of review of what she calls the philosophical keystones of capitalism. But let's start with this idea of reason and the role of reasons through the idea of rights. These are all topics that we've discussed in the previous sessions on man's rights and the role of government, although there's a little bit more about reason and the relation of reason to force here than we saw previously. Any thoughts, or Augustina, do you want to bring anything up from the chat on this idea of reason as man's essential characteristic? We had a question about her view of reason. Or if anyone wants to bring anything up now, you could write it into the chat or in the questions or raise your hand.
I have a question here from Gordon about, it says, whenever I talk to people about capitalism, almost 99% of the people think capitalism as Marx defined it. Then the discussion breaks apart because people can't get out of that box. How do we try to continue the discussion about political economy? Because people are emotionally committed to Marx's notion that capitalism alienated man from his basic nature.
Well, I find that experience of discussing capitalism surprising. I mean, Marx certainly looms large in the history of thought about it, but most people today, at least in America, I think view capitalism as a relatively positive thing, even if they have a very distorted view of it. If you look at, for example, the Democratic Party's primaries last year, you had a Democratic socialist running, so a socialist, not a capitalist, but even he was claiming, well, really, I'm a capitalist in this weird way, and Hillary Clinton was claiming I'm a capitalist. So the valence of the word has shifted to positive. And so I'd be surprised if you brought it up, you would get primarily, unless you're with a bunch of Marxists, people knowing about Marx's theory of alienation and so forth. But it might, I guess it depends on what circles you travel in. I'm more concerned with people having thinking it's good, but having a very superficial view of it and thinking it just means, you know, well, we're not full out communism and there's some kind of markets involved, and not understanding what the essence of the system is and what's good about markets. And therefore wanting to control them and have something like what we have today or worse. Onkar, any thoughts on people jumping to this kind of Marxist premise of capitalism? Have you encountered that?
Yeah, not so much anymore the alienation argument, though I think in some academic circles it's making a return. But the exploitation angle, I think, you still meet, even, I mean, you can sometimes trace it back to Marx, or they will trace it back to Marx, but even if they don't, that the idea that there's something inherently exploitative in capitalism, I think that is a remnant that people, and I agree that the capitalism it's I think partly due to Ayn Rand and some other thinkers, that it has shifted towards, this is something good, it's something about America that you want to preserve, even if you define it out of existence and so but it's a mixed, like, it's something good, but it also has these elements of exploitation. So there's always the search, can we get something that keeps the good things and gets rid of these inherently bad things in capitalism? I do find that you still get that kind of reaction.
Maria is
Yes.
saying go ahead, Agustina.
Yeah, sorry. Now, I was going to bring up Maria's comment. She says, we have a lot of that in Latin America. a lot of what Gordon was referring to. And I agree, in Latin America, capitalism is still defined as Marx defined it. I have to say, I have to agree with Onkar too, in the fact that here in the US in grad school, I've encountered some resistance to capitalism and trying to say, yes, but we need to regulate the markets and so on. But yeah, in Latin America, the view of capitalism is overall like negative, as opposed to American. It's a very, very American concept that capitalism is good.
That's interesting. I do see, of course, the constant calls for regulation and worries about exploitation. But most of the people I encounter who make those claims still want to say they're for capitalism, but with this overlay. The ones who I know who don't say that really identify as Marxists. And I know, like I went to philosophy grad school and there were plenty of people there who were like literal explicit Marxists and call themselves Marxists. And those people do talk that way. But it's interesting to know that that's a much more prevalent in the discussion in Latin America. Go ahead.
Just what Adam makes a comment too, because this is my experience with Europe. It depends on what country you are in Europe. So he says, for example, in Germany, capitalism is an evil buzzword, whereas in Poland, while people are not as positive as the Americans about it, the lesson of real socialism has at least created the opinion that the best system that's realistically possible. And that's my experience traveling through Europe. At some layer like Germany or France, there's a much more negative view of capitalism than in some of the Eastern Bloc countries that have suffered under socialism and communism.
Okay, so this is all interesting. We're a little bit out of where we want to be in our outline. So let's return to where we were in the progression, although I think this has been a valuable digression. And recall Rand starting off giving the philosophical foundations of capitalism. She's doing it by thinking about what is man's essential characteristic. She identifies reason as man's essential characteristic. Any thoughts or questions? I mean, I have something to say about this, about this view that we should start by identifying man's essential characteristic, about the idea that reason is the essential characteristic, or about Rand's view of reason and anything that might stand out about that. I mean, Steve asked on the chat earlier about reason, about the idea of an essential characteristic, and that Rand wants to endorse some form of essentialism, and he's concerned about whether this is tenable. There have been objections raised to essentialism. Parvuna now in the chat is saying it reminds her of Aristotle's virtue ethics, which also and the virtue ethics movement more generally. Virtue ethics is not Aristotle's term, it's a modern term of people who are reviving some ideas that are in Aristotle, that we want to base our ethics on a view of what human nature is, and that what's essential to human beings is that we have reason. Steve, I don't know that we should go too far into this now. Rand does have a somewhat distinctive view of essence that can be studied in her work on Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. I think generally, though, there was a period when it was really trendy to say there are no essences to things, and there's no nature, and there is no human nature, and so forth. Even within philosophy now, I think there's a lot of backpedaling on that, and a lot more within academic philosophy, a lot more recognition that there's something right about the concept of essence, about the need to group and define things. There are right and wrong ways to do it. I don't know that I would say that that's the dominant view in philosophy now, but it's certainly a large and well-respected view, and in part the virtue ethics movement, but not only that, contributed to a revival of that perspective. Rand, again, has a particular take on all of this, but I don't think we need to go into that level of granularity about her view for our purposes here. We can do a whole series of seminars on her view of definitions and essence if we want, and perhaps we'll get to that at some point. So the points that I would really want to flag about reason from the essay is that reason is man's means of survival. That's the first and foremost. Second, that reason operates by volition. So reasoning isn't automatic. You have to like choose to think, choose to engage or not engage your mind. And that choice is something that happens at an individual level. So nobody can think for anybody else. Thinking is individualistic. Reasoning is individualistic. And I think that idea of reason as individualistic is the core. Reason is freely chosen, and so is individualistic, is the core of Rand's individualism. What makes us not like other creatures, other animals, is that we live by reason, and reason is something that we each do individually. People are saying that there's feedback or an echo when I speak. I don't know if, Onkar, could you mute for a moment and we'll see if that's why I'm echoing? Are people not hearing me echo now, but they were before? Augustina, what are you finding?
Only sometimes when Onkar is not muted, I hear a little bit of feedback.
So maybe, Onkar, if you turn the volume of your speakers down slightly, that might help that, and then unmute. So I was saying reason is individualistic, and then reason as the productive faculty. So not only is reason, reason is the faculty by which we live, it's the faculty by which we come up with and choose values to pursue, but also importantly, as Rand puts it, production is the application of reason to the problem of survival. The way we use our reason to survive is we use it to project ideas of things to create and then to actually go out and produce them. And this is really important for understanding why the right to property is so important, because the way we live is by, again, using our reason, which is an attribute of the individual that's used by choice, to create things, the kinds of things that we need to keep us in existence. So those are the first points I would make about reason. And then the crucial pivotal point that gets us to the idea of rights is that reason doesn't function under force. An individual needs to be free to use his reason. Reason cannot be coerced. It just shuts down. And the idea that reason doesn't function under force, given that reason is our means of survival, leads to the idea that freedom is a survival requirement for human beings. And then the principle of rights is the principle that defines and sanctions the freedoms that we need to survive in a social context. So that's, I think, the progression that's going on in this section. And that's mostly a review of material we've covered in previous session. But I want to just pause and see if there's any questions or further thoughts on any of that, either from the group or Onkar, if you have things you want to add, or Augustina, if there were things that came up over the course of the week on the Facebook group that pertain to this.
I want to add one perspective that I think is important for thinking about the role of force and how she's singling it out. And that is, so you were stressing that for her, reason is volitional, and the two aspects of the reason is our means of survival. It's exercised by your own choice, and it requires your own effort. That's the core of her individualism. She stresses, she italicizes the right to disagree. And I think you have to think of it in that context, that knowledge takes individual effort, knowledge and values, and to understand what is true, what you should pursue, takes real work, it takes effort, it takes thinking, all that has to be done by the choice of an individual. And you can't be tied. So this, again, going back to the tribal premise, part of what I think is very objectionable from her perspective is the idea of it's just one unit. It's like one social organism. It's tying together the people who decide and who choose to think and orient themselves towards production, towards their own survival, towards creating and making things, to the people who choose not to do that. And part of what she's emphasizing here is the people who think need to be free of the people who don't. They can't be tied in that kind of way. And part of what the right to disagree means, I think, is the right to walk away and say, no, I don't think the way you're thinking about this is right. I don't think what you're valuing is right. I'm going my separate way, or we together are going our separate way from what you're doing. And force enters then to stop people from doing that. And to, no, you can't exercise your own independent judgment and your own independent. We're going to bring you back. We're going to tie you to us. We're going to force you against your judgment and will. So that whole perspective, I think, she's really stressing it in this essay.
There was some discussion in the Facebook group about the issue of forcing a mind. And Harry raised a question. For example, scientists that are forced to work under totalitarian regimes, they seem to think and be able to function. So he brings up that he takes a little bit of issue with the idea that Rand says that the mind does not work under compulsion. And he says that he can see the point where the qualification was different, with doesn't work as well, or eventually things decline, etc. But the distinction of rationality and force, he says that it continues to puzzle him. He doesn't quite get it. And Daniel responded to that, that irrational minds work different. And that, for example, going back to the example of a scientist, Daniel said there are many scientists who obviously think under totalitarian regimes, and they're even successful in their specific branch of science, but their minds are morally corrupt. So they are irrational minds in his judgment.
Onkar, do you have anything you want to add to or your take on Daniel's thought?
This isn't so much on Daniel's thought, though. I think that perspective is important as well. It's on thinking of places like Soviet Russia and his thought going on in those countries and under those regimes or forms of government. And I think part of the way to think about it is, insofar as you're subject to force, you're not able to think about. And when we talk about that, so the Soviet Union collapsed, and it collapsed economically, that it wasn't able to produce goods and certainly anywhere on the scale of what was promised, but anywhere on the scale of even a mixed economy. What you're talking about is more and more avenues are cut off, that you're not allowed to think in this area. You're not allowed, and it can be just either directly you're under orders that these are areas that if you start writing about, if you start discussing with other people, maybe we should change our government or our laws in certain kinds of ways, you're put in jail and sometimes executed for that. That collapses thinking in those areas. But there's all kinds of areas of the economy that you can't start your own business, you can't deviate from the 5-year plan. And that's more in terms of action, it's being cut off. But the result is nobody thinks about what company should I start? There's some new innovation that they see overseas in computers. What could we do with that? Nobody's thinking about that because they're subject to force in those areas. It's clear to them if they start thinking about it, the authorities are going to descend upon them. And it's in the pockets where there's some allowance still. Yeah, you can think about how to put satellites in orbit because this is for the prestige of the Soviet Union. And so long as you do it in the way that we want and so on, we'll grant you this leash that will give you some slack on the leash that you're allowed to do it. But so they're thinking insofar as they're not subject to force. But the wider context is they are. And I think even science and so on in these kinds of places is very corrupt. And that's part of the I think what then relates to Daniel's, what he's bringing up as well.
Yeah, the way I see it is that force constrains it's not that it makes reason function less well, it's that it constrains the areas and issues in which reason can function at all. And the more force, the more areas and issues are constrained. But it makes it, your thinking either becomes irrelevant to your action because you can't act on any thinking that is not in keeping with the whims of the people who are wielding force against you. Or if you try to think in a way that is relevant to your action, it closes off all kinds of questions from your being able to think about them, because you can't think on, so long as you're being boxed in by premises and ways of construing the questions and problems, so you're not able to challenge these, well, then you're not able to think about these things in a kind of rational way. All you're able to do is go through the motions, in fact, do like schoolwork assignments in a little box where you can think within these very narrow confines. And insofar as you don't have really fresh or original ideas and you're not trying to solve any difficult problem, then you can do a little bit of kind of minor busy-worky thinking within those little boxes, and it might be enough to keep you from immediately dying or let your society grind on gradually at a miserable pace. But this is why there's no innovation in these societies. This is why they're desperately poor. And if you're thinking about something like the USSR, and this is why people in them can't think about the broad kinds of questions about what they want to do or make of their lives, because they just don't have any choice over that. And then that again gets to Daniel's point. I want to recommend, it's unfortunately not, well, I guess it is available to people who want to join the Ayn Rand Society or become contributors. There's a really wonderful series of essays on this point of Rand's that force paralyzes the mind. 3 essays, almost adding up to a little book, by Darrell Wright, that are the first 3 chapters in a forthcoming collection on Ayn Rand's political philosophy that Robert Mayhew and I edited, called Foundations of Freedom, Reflections on Ayn Rand's Political Philosophy. And Darrell's 3 chapters on this are really fantastic. They're based on lectures he gave back in 1999, which are where I learned, one of the things I learned a lot of this material from. And I just thought they were great lectures, and the essay versions are even better. And so in March, the book will be out. You can pre-order it on Amazon now, or if you're really eager to get a glimpse of some of the chapters in it, Darrell's 3 chapters and a chapter by me in the book are available to people who are members or contributors of the Ayn Rand Society, which is the group that's putting out the book. And you can find their webpage at aynrandsociety.org. If you sign up as a contributor or member, which you can do online, you'll then get access to those chapters and some of the other pieces in the book that have been draft versions of them from a previous year's sessions. Onkar also has 2 pieces in that book that are really fantastic, and a number of other people who you'll have heard of you can read about the table of contents online. So for a lot of detail on this point that force negates and paralyzes the mind, and then its relation to rights, see Darrell Wright's pieces. They're really, really good. Okay, let's move on to the issue of how to define capitalism, unless, is there anything else we should take up before we do that?
Well, you can take this up I know you want to talk about the definition, the special importance of property rights that both in the essay and Rand's argument, and then it comes into the definition. I think either talk about it in connection with the definition or before it, but it's an important point.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I don't have more to say about it right now on the general level than what I said about, well, the point of property, I talked about productiveness, right, as an important aspect of being rational, and we use reason to survive by producing things. Well, then property then is important, right? Property is a part of our means of survival. And so the right to property, that is the freedom to act in ways to produce property, and then to have dominion over it, to be able to use it, to be able to consume it and control how it's consumed, is an important part of the freedom that we need to live by reason. And Rand talks about rights being the recognition of our nature in a social context, right? The recognition that there's a certain way we need to act, the rational way to act, a kind of rational form of life, which is the human form of life. Part of what that involves is the creation and then use and disposal of property. The right to property is the right to do that. Anything more you want to add on the property right?
Yeah, just to read a little of what she puts in here, because she ties it to the right to disagree, and I think it's an interesting connection, that the way she puts it. So she writes, "The right to agree with others is not a problem in any society. It is the right to disagree that is crucial. It is the institution of private property that protects and implements the right to disagree, and thus keeps the road open to man's most valuable attribute, in parentheses, valuable personally, socially, and objectively, close brackets, the creative mind." And that it's sort of the flip side. We talked a little bit about there's no innovation in a communist, socialist regimes. They institute and the initiation of physical force, but they abolish private property, and what they make impossible is the right to disagree. And again, if we're thinking in terms of the pursuit of knowledge, this is a point that's stressed in the Fountainhead. You can see it throughout history, even in better periods. The innovators, the people with new ideas, new thoughts, they're often opposed. And if it's some kind of system where you need majority agreement, you got to convince everybody that this is right and I'm right about this, it's impossible to function. The individual shouldn't have to function like that. But if you make it in that he has to try to function like that, he just shuts down, that you can't convince. And what we'll talk about in the second half of the essay, she talks in some detail of the way innovation and the innovator work under capitalism. And it's such a new phenomenon in history, and it's part of the explanation. If one in the 19th century is trying to explain, like, why are we seeing this unprecedented phenomenal growth? Her perspective is, well, the creative mind has been unleashed, and private property is part of that unleashing.
Good. So let's move on to what I'm calling the fifth section of the. Let's move on to, this is my fifth point on our outline of what to discuss today, but it's the point of how Rand goes about defining capitalism. So it's section 2D in the outline of the piece that I have, and I've posted that outline on Facebook in the Facebook group for anyone who wants to read it. Notice what's happened, right? She started the piece talking about the field of political economy and how it's all a mess from her view. It's all a mess because it's on this tribal premise. Instead, we need to start by thinking about man and human nature. She's then gone through human nature, talked about how it requires in a social context the principle of individual rights, and now she's going to talk about the implications of all of this for what social system is appropriate to man. Her conclusion is going to be that the capitalist social system is the one appropriate to man, and she's going to define it in light of this view of human nature that she's laid out that give rise to the need for it. So she begins by asking what a social system is. And I find that interesting, right? So the genus of capitalism is going to be social system. She says what a social system is. A social system is presumably what's studied by the field of political economy. And what is a social system? She says it's a set of moral, political, economic principles embodied in a society's laws, institutions, and government, which determine the relationships, the terms of association among the men living in a geographical area, right? So that's what a social system is. And then she's going to say, well, how then do we define and differentiate different social systems? Capitalism is one of them. What's distinctive about it? Well, she goes on to quickly say what the defining characteristics of social systems are. There are only two fundamental questions, and she then says they're aspects of the same question, that determine the nature of a social system. Does a social system recognize individual rights? And does a social system ban force from human relationships? So if you are familiar with the traditional Aristotelian method of definition, which Rand endorses in her book, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, you define something by giving a genus, that's the wider category of phenomena to which the thing you're defining belongs, and then a differentia. And the differentia tells you how the particular thing you're trying to define differs from the other things that are in this larger family. And you want to do both of these things in fundamentals. You can put everything in a million different groups, but we're asking, like, what's the fundamental group to which this thing belongs, that its membership in that group explains the most about it? Well, capitalism is fundamentally a social system. And then the question is, of all the ways in which we might distinguish one social system from another, which ones are fundamental, which ones are deep and explain all the other things about them? And Rand says there are two things that are deep, fundamental, that distinguish one social system from another. And really, one of them is deeper and more fundamental than the other. And that's, does the social system recognize individual rights? And as a consequence of that, does it ban force from human relationships? And then she elaborates a little bit on this in the essay, but her definition of capitalism flows right out of this. I'm quoting now the definition. Capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. Put aside the property side of it for a moment, we'll come back to that. But it's the system that, so the fundamental is it's a social system and it's based on rights. And it's going to follow from its recognizes rights, that based on the recognition of rights, that it bans force, and then all the other features of it are going to follow from these. But then she makes a special point to emphasize including property rights, and then in which all property is privately owned.
I have a question from Diego related to this.
Uh-huh.
He says, in practice, is it possible or convenient or necessary that the entire territory of a country be private, including streets, beaches, and public spaces? Otherwise, who should administer such spaces that are public?
Well, I don't think the whole territory of a country needs to be private, because much of the territory of a country won't be owned at all. I mean, most of America is empty wilderness that's now viewed as public land, but I think should properly be viewed as unowned altogether. And so it's neither private nor public, it's just unowned, and at some point somebody can come to own it. But that's not the kind of thing Diego's talking about here, not the fact that, like, most of California is empty and no one owns it. He's talking about beaches, streets, and parks and things like that. And these are all things that are being developed, have been developed, and are being used by people. And they ought to be owned by the people who have developed and are using them, or some subset of them. And I don't know why it would be inconvenient. What was the question? It's certainly possible, and I don't see why it would be inconvenient. And it's necessary to respect, to fully respect the principle of rights. But I think we'd want to concretize what alleged inconveniences there are in streets being privately owned or beaches being privately owned to really follow out this question. Onkar, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, not especially. I wasn't sure if there's in the background thinking of what do you think about government property, and you might have a perspective of what laissez-faire capitalism means. I think for sure this is Rand's perspective. It means no, streets are not owned by the government, beaches are not owned by the government, and as you said, there can be things that are unowned, and we'll actually talk about that when we talk about property next week in some more detail. But you might ask, how do you think of a government military base or the Capitol? Do you think of this as government property? Is it private property that is leased to the government or something like that? And I think those are details of political science, of how to think about them. I think the way I take her definition is it's in the economic sphere. So the government doesn't own factories and farms, and it's one of the players in the economy. But if you think of it, it owns an army base. That's, I think, a different context.
Yeah, I don't take this to mean, although it could be read that way, that the government doesn't own the police cars or the land that the police station is sitting on. But that's, in a certain sense, privately owned, in that it's owned by the government, but the government is an organization that has a particular purpose, and it's owned by the government in the way that a private entity would own something for a particular purpose and delimited to that realm. It doesn't operate these things in the public interest. So the idea of public property is we own a bunch of stuff all in common as the government, and then we decide, hey, what should we do with this that's best for the public? And that's something that the government shouldn't do. If it owns a police station, it owns a police station because there needs to be a police station. And if there doesn't need to be a police station anymore, or for some reason we're going to change, the police are going to move to a new place or whatever, it's not, hey, this is now government land that the government can continue to have and do whatever it thinks is best for the people with. It has to sell it. Or maybe it shouldn't own it in the first place and it can only lease it. I think that issue is a detail. But again, what's important isn't that there's nothing the owner of which is the government, but that there's nothing the owner of which is the public. The owner of the police station wouldn't be the public or even the government as a whole, but the police department, which granted is a branch of the government, but for a particular delimited purpose. It's the thing that that's opposed to, again, is the idea that there are public resources owned and administered by the government for the good of everyone. Okay, so that's any further questions or thoughts on the definition of government? Or sorry, definition of capitalism and the context giving rise to that.
Just to note that in the Facebook group, Amesh, I think, gave a very good comment. He said the main differentiator from all other definitions is that it is the only one based on individual rights, not common good, referring to Rand's definition of capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's right. So in that sense, it's different. It's also different in that it's defining it as a social system. It's sometimes defined more narrowly as an economic system. So that's something that's, I don't know that she's the only one to define it that way, but that might stand out about her definition to people. It doesn't talk about the allocation or use of common resources, because that's all the definitions that do that are starting on the tribal premise. Any other points about the definition?
I'd say two other things that it doesn't mention that are often mentioned, which is capital. So I'm thinking of capitalism. And it's the issue of capital is important, but I think she thinks of a derivative. So another aspect of her view of definitions is that when you have various distinguishing characteristics, you pick the fundamental, the one that explains all or most of the other distinguishing characteristics. And I think she thinks the recognition of individual rights, and part of what recognition means here, it's, as Greg, you were saying, it's a moral, social, economic. So it's recognized morally that rights are important. They're implemented in the law, and as a result, in people's economic transactions, they can count on the fact that their rights will be upheld and protected. That what you get as a result of that is massive capital accumulation by individuals, which she's going to stress in the second part of the essay, of savings. And the other feature that is often addressed is competition, that it's the system of competition or something like that. And I think she thinks of competition as very important, a proper understanding of competition. But it's, again, you have to think of it, it's a competition of people producing when their rights are respected, of producing and trading. So that too is a derivative of a recognition and protection of rights. So she wouldn't use those as defining characteristics.
Yeah, it's really interesting in this context that she does include property as a defining characteristic. And we want to think, maybe pause a little bit more on why that is, right? So it's a social system based on the recognition of rights, including property rights in which all property is privately owned. And if you look at how she elaborates on this in the paragraphs right after the definition, and these are paragraphs you referenced earlier, Onkar, we get the idea that the recognition of individual rights means that we have to banish force from human relationships. We were talking about this last week in connection with the nature of government. And we need a government to put the use of retaliatory force under objective control. So the first point to elaborate is rights means banishment of force, right? Requires banishments of force. And this is the basic metaphysical fact of man's nature, between his survival and his use of reason, that capitalism recognizes and protects by banishing force. So the first thing she does to elaborate on it is stress the recognition of individual rights. What this means in practice is banning force. And what it means to ban force, starting with the next paragraph, is that all human relationships then are voluntary. Men are free to cooperate or not, deal with one another or not, as their own individual judgments, convictions, or interests dictate. They can deal with one another only in terms of and by means of reason. Okay, so this is all elaborating on protection of individual rights. We've not mentioned property yet, right? It leads to banning of force. What banning of force amounts to is making all relationships, creating a context in which all relationships are voluntary rather than forced. But then property rights are the only way to implement this, so the idea goes, right? And so we get the point that Onkar was talking about. It is the right to disagree that's crucial. And the institution of private property protects and implements the right to disagree. Why? Because it, and think of it as an institution of private property, right? We don't have none of these other rights are described as institutions yet. But the idea that there's a way, that it's an instituted way, recognized by the whole of society, by which I can make something my own. If I produce a value, it's I have to live by producing values, but there's a way instituted in the social system that we live in which it can become recognized by everybody else that the value I produced is mine, and that I properly have dominion over it, and you properly have dominion over other things. And there are methods to define which things we each have dominion over. That enables us to kind of disentangle our lives from one another, or keep our lives disentangled from one another, so that if we disagree, I can go my way and you can go yours, and we know what things go with me and what things go with you. Whereas if the land we're on is common to each of us, and we each live on this land, and each fish in this stream, and each do all of these things together, and the physical bits of the world that we inhabit are the same, and the objects that we use are the same, and it's not clear which are mine and which are yours, if there's no mine and thine distinct, as I think it's Hobbes who put it, right? Then if we disagree, it's unclear how we can't agree to disagree, so to speak, in that situation. We need to be able to separate out our lives to be able to agree to disagree. And since our lives involve making things in the world, making things out of the stuff that's in the world, we need to figure out which stuff I've made and is part of my life and which is part of yours, in order, again, to protect that ability to agree and disagree. So then, quoting again, it's the institution of private property that protects and implements the right to disagree, and thus keeps the road open to man's most valuable attribute, valuable personally, socially, and objectively, the creative mind. And this is the cardinal difference between capitalism and collectivism. So it's by recognizing a right to property, and that recognition means defining, coming up with particular laws and so forth to make regular and objective and known to all what the means are of acquiring property, what the extent of an individual's property is, what the boundaries are and so forth, and how these things are going to be adjudicated, that we're able to implement the principle of keeping our lives separate. And that's essential to the whole principle of freedom, to the whole idea of rights, and that's what makes capitalism distinct from collectivism.
Yeah, that's an important point, and it is. I think she thinks of it as this is the goal. I mean, so this is explicitly in a proper system what you're trying to do. It's not an accidental feature of it. And part of why we're featuring a whole discussion then of property and this as an ongoing issue in an economic system, because this is what it's a goal you're actually trying to achieve, and writing the laws in order to be able to achieve it.
Gotten a number of questions. Nick is just asking now in the Q&A online, and I think Steve asked on Facebook earlier about the use of the word capitalism as a name for this system at all. It was named by Marx initially. Most definitions of it, at least Marx's, focuses on capital and the class of the capitalists and so forth. And Onkar, you pointed out that Rand's definition doesn't focus on that. What Nick asks, might Rand's response be to an argument saying that it's poorly named? Maybe we shouldn't use this word. And again, Steve raised that question at all. Also, Steve raised it in the context of noting that when Rand has an unusual view of something, she sometimes continues using the words other people use for it, and sometimes thinks we need to reject these terms altogether because there are errors in them. Thoughts on why she chooses to keep the term capitalism?
I mean, I don't. Some of the discussion was: is it a package deal? Is it putting together things that differ essentially in whether in their value significance and their something's true and something false, and you're trying to put them together? So package deals she thinks of as you're putting elements that don't belong together, that you can't think of as having fundamental similarities, that you can think of them together as a unit. So there's something very destructive in terms of thought going on in regard to package deals. I do not think that she thinks of capitalism as a package deal as it's being used. I think she thinks of it as I said, it's an important aspect of the new system that was coming into existence, that people were able to save and save in a way that they never could before. So they could produce, they could not consume everything, they could be secure in saving, they could have contractual relationships, she often stresses this, going into 99-year terms. And so it's just this vast expansion of the horizon of what kind of production and voluntary relationships are possible in the economic realm that makes possible savings. And she stresses that savings is the engine by which you increase production, or it's one of the aspects of getting a dramatic increase in production. So it's not the fundamental, but it's an important aspect. And I think also important in thinking about, so it's capitalism and it's a term used by Marx. Marx and the other socialists, and Ayn Rand thought this often happens, that the enemies understand the fundamentals of something and of something good more than the defenders do. Their focus was on property and private property, and this is what the system is about. And Marx even had some semi-correct views about this is what made it more productive than prior systems of social organization and so on. Though well, leave that aside. And he's right about that. I mean, in her definition, she's, as we were talking about, really focusing on the issue of property rights and that all property is privately owned. So it's not, they're focusing on things that are important. Now they're damning it, that capital, it's not really productive and it exploits labor, and labor is really the source of production. So, and property, oh no, we would be way better if we could get to where we can abolish all property, and we're going to have communism, and we're going to frolic in the Marx's version of the Garden of Eden and so on. But what they're naming are crucial features of the new system. And she's now saying, yes, you can have a more fundamental perspective, and you have to recognize that all these things are good, and you have to understand them on their own terms and in the right terms. And I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense of why she's keeping the term and defending it.
Pooja is asking if the term free market would be better.
You're muted, Greg.
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, I think the term free market is fine also to name an aspect of the system, but and there are situations in which you might use that term, but I think that no, capitalism is captures the nature of the social system as a whole, whereas a free market just is one very important aspect of it. And I think the way to think about whether to retain whether you have a valid concept here, even if the people who formed the concept didn't identify the distinction being drawn in the most fundamental terms, is what things are being differentiated from one another, from other things, and put together. You have a concept where you have a phenomena or a group of things that are kind of put together as opposed to certain foils. And someone's noticed that certain things belong together and are the same in an important way, as opposed to something else that they're differentiating it from. And then over time, we're going to learn more and more and come to understand more and more deeply how these things are the same as opposed to that other thing. We might learn to identify in deeper and more causally fundamental terms what that difference is. And so you get the term capitalism to group together things like the way the United States was organized and the way Great Britain was organized and the way other parts of the world, in Europe especially, were starting to get organized more, as opposed to the feudal way they had been organized before, which new way had a different role for landowners and owners of factories and so forth, that involved different kinds of employment and social relationships, that involved a greater freedom of people to move around and to get different kinds of jobs, that was accompanied by a massive change in how people worked and what they produced, and indeed a massive growth in what was produced and a change in the standard of living. And there is a real phenomenon here of societies are now organized in a different way than they were before. And a lot of the aspects of that organization were noted, and some of the causal relations among those aspects were noted. And then the word capitalism was introduced for this. And all of that is right and correct, and a real grasp on a distinct new phenomenon, which then we can understand more deeply. And then Rand gives us a deeper understanding of it, that it's the social system that's based on the recognition of individual rights, in which all property is privately owned.
Gordon makes an observation in the chat. He says that he thinks that Rand uses the term capitalism for the same reason that she chose to use the word selfishness. They are radical, and Rand wanted people to think about those words.
Yeah, I think there's probably an element of truth to that, but I think it's secondary. So I do think she liked taking the bull by the horns, so to speak, and defending something that people were damning and not backing away when they were damning it for the wrong reasons, and it's in fact good, and not backing away from the language in which they chose their language for it. And I think that's something that's going on in her use of selfishness. But I don't think that's the fundamental. I think if she didn't think there was a valid concept here, that the thing they were damning was really the same phenomenon that she was praising, and that it was a reasonable term for it, then I don't think she would have kept it. I wanted to. Felipe raised a question on the Q&A that I think is interesting. This is responding, I assume, to some of what I said about property rights. If our lives aren't metaphysically separate, he asks, in the sense that we have to work volitionally to implement this principle, presumably the principle of rights, what makes this separation valid? I have some things to say on that, but Onkar, do you have anything you want to say in response to Felipe?
No, get ahead, because I'm not sure I get quite the question, so you seem to, so go ahead.
The idea is we need to work together to define rights as a society, to recognize them, in particular property rights, to come up with the procedures to recognize when somebody's acquired property and so forth. If that's the case, and this is something we need to work together to do, then maybe we're not really distinct and separate beings metaphysically. And then how is this principle of individualism really valid? And I think this principle is a recognition on the part of a society of the fact that pre-exists the society, that human beings are individualistic in our manner of functioning, our basic manner of functioning, and need, if we're going to work together, if we're going to live together in a society, to have that society organized in a way that respects and facilitates that ability to live individualistically. So we could live outside of a society, not all that well, but you can function on your own or in a small family somewhere, right? There are facts about you that make you able to function and make you have certain needs if you're going to cooperate with people. When you're choosing to cooperate with people, you can get together and make collective group decisions. The group decisions amount to all the individuals making a decision and agreeing on it, or agreeing on a decision procedure by which we can decide whose decisions will hold sway, or voting, or whatever it is. But there are ways to make decisions as a group, right, that ultimately come from the decisions of the individuals. And if we are going to decide to get together and live together as a group, because we each have an individual nature and individual needs that we think can best be served this way, then we have to decide on a policy for the group that will be based on those facts about us and based on the needs that we have when living together in a society that stem from the fundamental facts of our nature. And the fundamental facts of our nature are that we live by reasoning, and that reasoning is an attribute of the individual and can only reason individually. And so that's the foundation of, that's what makes the separation valid, if you want to call it that. That is the separation of the spheres of our individual rights. We each need to be free of one another to act and to live. If we're going to live so close to one another that we're in effect in danger always of stepping on one another, then we need to clearly mark off in a way that we mutually understand the spheres of each of our individual action, so that we can go about deciding for ourselves how to live our own lives in a context where we are near to one another and liable to accidentally, and in some cases intentionally, tread on one another, so to speak.
So should we turn to, you quoted Ayn Rand's definition of a social system, that it's a set of moral, political, economic principles embodied in the society's laws, institutions, in terms of association. We've talked a bit about the political aspects of capital and the individual rights. We've talked a bit about the economic aspects, that you need a very individualist view of production and what flows out of property rights and the aspects of real capital accumulation, of savings by individuals and so on. She is arguing that the most distinctive feature, I think, of the system of capitalism is the moral principles embodied in it. And this is when she makes then a distinction between theories of the good, or you might think about like overall approaches to thinking about morality. I think we should turn to that. And Greg, you want to start us off on some thoughts about
absolutely. So this is her distinction between the intrinsic, the subjective, and the objective. I think we mentioned this in passing in previous sessions last week, and this is a really big theoretical innovation, and it's wider even than ethics, right? These are three theories of the relationship of the mind to the world, and they're theories that she uses in other contexts in her thought. And it's interesting that they first come up here in an essay not on metaphysics or epistemology or even fundamentally on ethics, but an essay on capitalism. So that's just a kind of striking feature of Rand's thought, that she notices these innovative things where she notices them first. And I think this idea is actually in Atlas Shrugged, although not in these terms. But this is the first time she formulates it this way. It has a big shaping influence on her thought. It's, I think, the basic idea in it is why her system of philosophy is called objectivism. There's a lot of Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, which is a really powerful kind of systematic presentation of her philosophy, really stresses this idea of objectivity as central to her thought, and shows how it's there throughout, and it's central to her ethics. It's, again, I think a central theme of Atlas Shrugged, although not in exactly these terms. So just first, the kind of hugeness of this distinction to Rand's thought, and if she's right about it, as I think she is, it's a real major innovation in the history of philosophy. So typically people distinguish between something that's subjective, all in the head, made up, and on the other hand, objective, out in reality, and it's the mind's job to kind of figure it out, right? So there's the invented, the subjective, the come up with, and the discovered, the objective, the out there, what's in the object versus what's subjective in your head. And this is what Rand thinks is a false dichotomy. There's a third option, or rather what's typically called, much of what's typically called objective, objective as it's often used, is a package deal between two different sorts of things. Stuff that's actually just allegedly out there in reality, not due to anyone's thinking. And stuff that is due to someone's thinking, due to reasoning and choosing, but that's not come up with arbitrarily or subjectively, but is based on what's out there in reality, and made by a human being in accordance with a method that's needed to get at what's really out there in reality. And this status of objective, Leonard Peikoff defines it nicely as to be objective in one's thinking or in one's functioning is to be volitionally in accordance with reality via the method of logic. I might have changed a word or two, but that's the gist of his definition. So the objective is that which is created by man volitionally in accordance with reality by following a method, the method of logic, right? As opposed to what's out there in reality independent of human beings, or what's created arbitrarily by human beings. And the idea is then that objective, as it's often used, is a package deal, and it has the effect of treating things that are human creations as though they're out there in reality, and therefore not achievements. And treating anything that we have created as though it can't be based on reality and is arbitrary and we can create it any way that we want. Whereas in fact, we need to create the things that we create in a certain way, for a certain purpose, based on a certain method, all based on the nature of reality, including our own natures. And that's the key insight in the concept of objectivity. Onkar, further thoughts on the crucial innovation of this concept of objectivity generally? And before we talk about its role in this essay in particular?
Yeah, I think what you're stressing is important. I too, just so the more, just noting that this is where it comes in Ayn Rand's thought. And I also find it interesting the way it's presented. It's sort of presented as, this is kind of obvious. If I just point it out, can't you all see this? So it's not clear to me she thought of it at this point in time as this is a major innovation that people won't understand. And in the history of objectivism and people learning about objectivism, this was a major, when this was introduced and people thought, okay, oh, so you're saying there's not two, there's three, and we reject those two. And it is like when we talk about objective reality, when it just means independent of consciousness, that's not really the meaning of objective in the full, when we talk about objectivism. It's all very interesting, I think. And in terms of thinking about it in terms of ethics, I think one really has to work. So she's claiming, she puts it something like, in essence, there's three theories. And you need to think about different theories in ethics. She brings up some, and to think, like, is this really true that it ends up being, you really would classify it as it's a version of the subjectivist theory, or it's a version of the intrinsicist theory? Because this is sort of a classification of theories. So in this case, particular moral theories, and then saying, well, they have this in common. and they're what I'm calling, it's a subjectivist type of theory. And these other theories have this in common, that they give no role to human consciousness, human knowledge. And it takes a lot of work to think, like, is this the right way to divide up theories? But I too have come to think, yeah, this is right, and it's a very powerful way of understanding what is going on.
It's also, I think, in a way, it's a division of theories, but it's sort of objective versus the other two. Intrinsicist and subjectivist theories tend to shade into one another, because what's happening is the objectivist view is saying there's a certain thing that's mind-made, that's man-made, but in accordance with facts and in order to accord with facts. And this is a whole category of things. In a context where people are used to thinking things are either out there and not made by the mind, or they're made by human beings, but they're independent of facts. And so most theories place things into one or the other of those categories, and then they go back and forth in ethics or in other things about which things are objective and which things are intrinsic. And so you can see it as, one or the other type of theories, and they often blur the lines. But it's the crucial idea is that there's a role for the mind in creating things that have to be created right or properly. And the standards of rightness or propriety are based on, again, our natures and the nature of reality. So let's just read through the couple of paragraphs, or look through the couple of paragraphs that are the keys here, and notice a few points about them. There are, in essence, three schools of thought on the nature of the good: the intrinsic, the subjective, and the objective. The intrinsic theory holds that the good is inherent in certain things or actions as such, regardless of their context and consequences, regardless of any benefit or injury they may cause to the actors and subjects involved. It is a theory that divorces the concept of good from beneficiaries and the concept of value from valuer and purpose, claiming that the good is good in, by, and of itself. So according to the intrinsic theory, goodness is just a property of things. It's a property of certain things that they have intrinsically, thus the intrinsic theory, in themselves, rather than in relation to anything else. And in particular, I think what's most important here is rather than in relation to a valuer. Because I think there are versions of the theory that still count as intrinsicist, that at least have the idea of, well, this is good for him and this is good for her, but it's not because they value it. It's good for them just sort of in the nature of things. And it amounts to, it's just good that he have this or that she have this. And you can see this if you read G.E. Moore, for example, on goodness. He's probably the clearest cut example of someone in recent history of thought who's an intrinsicist, although Plato certainly is an arch example. Then there's the subjectivist theory, quoting again, that holds that the good bears no relation to the facts of reality, that it is a product of man's consciousness created by his feelings, desires, intuitions, or whims, and that it is merely an arbitrary postulate or emotional commitment. So the intrinsic theory, still quoting, holds that the good resides in some sort of reality independent of man's consciousness, and the subjectivist theory holds that the good resides in man's consciousness independent of reality. And I think that's the crucial sentence. So it's not just that the problem with intrinsicism is that it doesn't see that good is relational, but it doesn't see that it's relational specifically to consciousness, to a human consciousness. And the problem with subjectivism is that it sees goodness as only in the relation to consciousness, not as involving reality. So the objective theory then holds that the good is neither an attribute of things in themselves, nor of man's emotional state, but, and here's the essence, an evaluation of the facts of reality by man's consciousness according to a rational standard of value. And rational in this context means derived from the facts of reality and validated by a process of reason. So the idea is values involve evaluation, and evaluation is a conscious process, but a conscious process that's a rational process, and rational here means fact-based. And that's the whole key to, I think, Rand's philosophy and her ethics. The good is an aspect of reality in relation to man. It's got to be discovered, not invented, but it's not something that's discovered in the sense of it exists fully as objective prior to the discovery. Rather, there's the material for it, or the basis of it, that has to be discovered, and then the good is the discovery of it, not only the thing that's discovered as it existed prior to or independent of the discovery. That's anyway how I think of it.
On Facebook, there was a question from Harry. He clarified he was being the devil's advocate. He said, each person in capitalism make his own decision. How is that not subjective?
I think we should maybe hold off on that till next week, where we're talking about how objectivity is embodied in the market. I'm not sure. Onkar, what do you think? Do you have anything to say about that now?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to postpone it.
Okay. So the one thing I think we really need to stress about this objective theory is that it has a role for the mind that the other theories don't have. I think that's going to be really important for understanding its role in capitalism, particularly next week when we talk about the functioning of an economy. It has a role for the mind that the other theories don't have. In intrinsicism, what's good is just good, and the mind's not involved in it, or at most it just kind of registers what's good, just notices what's good. But there's nothing really, it's not involved in the being good of things. What's good is just good, independent of your mind. And on subjectivism, what's good is good, its goodness is created by your consciousness, but not by any kind of reasoning or rational process of your consciousness, not by one that does what reason does, namely respond to facts, tract facts, process facts, integrate facts, figure things out. So there's for neither intrinsicism nor subjectivism is your reasoning involved in the goodness of things for you. Things are either good wholly independent of you, or if you're related to their being good, it's not through the reasoning that you do. And capitalism is, in Rand view, the system of the mind, the system that recognizes and values and rewards and the role of intelligence in life. And the objectivity of value, the role of intelligence in goodness and in the value of things to people, is sort of essential to what's distinctive about capitalism. And again, we're going to see this next week when we look in detail at her view of the market and at everything about capitalism. And that's another, by the way, feature of the name capitalism. Capital has to do with head, right? I mean, if you think of the Latinate meaning, and the capitalists, the one who have aren't just the ones who have the money, but they're also the ones who have the plan, the ones who come up with what to do. And they're the ones who are engaged in the reasoning about how the economy should function, or anyway, playing a role in the reasoning about it in a way that was not recognized in and was not central in previous social systems.
On this last issue, or the second last issue that you brought up, that it's an issue of the reasoning of a mind, I think it's important, and it's the deeper roots of the objective theory and how she thinks about it, that she italicizes. It's an evaluation of the facts of reality, but it's an evaluation is italicized. And she thinks of an active evaluation as a form of knowledge when it goes right. And that's important and distinctive to her view, I think, that she's thinking of it as a form of knowledge. And then it's the connection. She goes on to talk about that that the intrinsic and subjective approaches license the use of force, and the objective theory sort of showcases, or it's another perspective on why force is so detrimental. Now here more in the case of the values and the pursuit of values. But what she's stressing is that the pursuit of values requires knowledge, and that the valuer is applying detailed knowledge to figure out what is actually will contribute to his particular life, and then going out and pursuing it, creating, making it. But it all has to be seen as infused with knowledge. And if one has got the point that force is directed against, to say it's directed against the mind is against the knowing mind. It's against the pursuit of knowledge. This helps get it's a deep perspective on why you can't achieve the good by force, because what the good requires is knowledge of that individual. He has to understand what he's doing, why he's doing it, how it contributes to his life, and he's doing it because of all that. And if you try now to bypass all that, is what force does, and says your thinking doesn't matter, your judgment doesn't matter. It's not just, so we were talking before of the scientist, and he can't figure out things, but her whole perspective is, it's not just the scientist. It's true of the scientist that Galileo can't function under orders, but nor can a Rockefeller or an Edison, or, I mean, you can take some of the great industrialists. They can't function under orders either, because essential to what they're doing is a form of knowledge about values. And if you direct a gun at that, it destroys the thinking just as it does of Galileo trying to come up with a new understanding of motion. And that's such a deep connection to get, and that linkage of someone like a Galileo with a Rockefeller, which most people don't think of putting together. It's a really important perspective, I think, that she's bringing out.
Related to this, there was some discussion in the Facebook group, and I see that Felipe brought it up just now in the Q&A. What would you say is it, how would you say that Rand's theory of objective value is different or similar to the Austrian School of Economics theory of subjective value?
Onkar, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about it, and I think you can think of it as it's a rebellion against the intrinsic approach, and this is what often happens. And when you have a false dichotomy, this is what often happens. It's a grasp. There's something really wrong with the intrinsic approach, and if you think of it in terms of economics, it's not that each good just has a value attached to it. It's sort of written in the fabric of reality. That to take a classic problem that they were thinking of and trying to figure out, it's look, isn't it written into reality that doesn't, an example Adam Smith uses, that water is more valuable than diamonds, because water, it's necessary to life. If you don't have it in a few days, you're going to die. And then who needs diamonds in order to live? And so you're getting this connection to life and survival, but it's like isn't it obvious that one contributes more than the other? And yet the price of diamonds is higher than the price of water. How can you explain this? And often the perspective is, well, something's going wrong in the market. And there's a whole perspective of thinking, no, this is the whole wrong way to think about economic values, economic prices, the whole phenomenon, because you're omitting the agents and the actors and the fact that they're after things and that they need to create and they need to produce, and that water might be readily available, and yet it takes a tremendous amount to be able to get and produce diamonds. So there's a whole host of things that they're trying to figure out. There's something really wrong with the intrinsic approach, and you need to bring in the agent. You need to bring in the subject of economic transactions, and it's often, and I think with Mises, it's thought of rightly as it's the individual, and someone before brought up methodological individualism. It's not just you have to bring in humanity as a whole or something like that. It's you have to bring up the individual actors and what they're doing. But the tendency, I think, is if you don't have the category of objective that Ayn Rand is arguing, that you have to think of it as a definite relationship and that knowledge is involved, the tendency is in rebelling against the error of intrinsicism is you formulate it and you conceptualize it in subjectivism in the way that Ayn Rand is talking about subjectivism, that it's really just made up by the person, and the facts of reality, that's not what's going on. It's all the decisions, the desires, the wants of the subject. And that gets more and more pushed. And I think you see in some of the formulations of Mises, that's the real emphasis. And it's sort of, they're groping for a better way to conceptualize and they can't come up with it. And when you have two false alternatives, what typically happens is you go from one to the other. And if they're both wrong, it's you see this a lot in the history of thought, of moving back and forth because you can't live with either one. And I think that's part of what's going on in economics and trying to conceptualize these issues.
In a piece in the same book I recommended earlier that's coming out in March, Foundations of a Free Society, and again can be pre-ordered already on Amazon, edited by Robert Mayu and myself. There's a piece by Rob Tarr who talks about the different schools of thought in economics and the theories of value on which they're implicitly based. And he argues that Austrian economics is in fact implicitly based on an objective theory of value like Rand's, although it wasn't articulated by them, as opposed to the intrinsic theory of value in classical economics or a subjective theory of value, a kind of full-fledged real subjective theory of value. And it's not that he's saying that Mises isn't, I don't think he's disagreeing with what Onkar was just saying, that there's a respect in which Mises is still going over to what's actually subjective. But if you think about what's driving the distinctive arguments in the Austrian school, and he goes back especially to Menger, but also to von Mises, it's a recognition of the kind of constellation of facts that are properly conceptualized by an objective theory of value, and that you need that theory of value to kind of fully conceptualize and maintain that distinction. So that's one take on this by Rob Tarr, and I thought very interesting. I'm not expert enough on economics to be confident in my judgment of the different schools of thought. I know, Onkar, you know a bit more about it than I do. Diego saying the use of subjective is not the same in the Austrian school as in objectivism, and I think that's right, but it's not as different as it could be, and maybe should be. Okay, do we have any other questions that we want to take now? We have a few minutes left before we have to end today. I mean, the capitalism, so the argument in this essay goes, is the system of objectivity. And what we're going to talk about next time is what that means in particular in regard to the functioning of a market economy, and how the way in which objectivity is manifest and embodied in the functioning of a market economy, and the way in which the attacks on a market economy stem in one way or another from intrinsicism or subjectivism, and on which an objective theory of value is necessary to maintain an individualist perspective on a society, and on what's good in a society, and on how to evaluate a society, so that the tribal premise that's so endemic in political economics, or in political economy rather, is a kind of manifestation of assuming the subjective and intrinsic views of value, or intrinsic views of value. But do we have any hands or any last questions? Adam Gaglio is asking, he says, Onkar, you mentioned that competition properly understood is an important aspect of capitalism, but not essential. He finds this concept is used in confusing ways. Can we recommend a resource with a proper explanation of the role of competition in a free society? No resource comes immediately to mind to me. Does anything come to mind to you on that?
There's some, I mean, just straight from an economics point of view, I think there's some Hayek and Kerzner that they have some good things on thinking how to think about competition. But I'm trying to think of Rand's where she talks about it from the more moral perspective. There's one article, but it's not coming to mind which one it is.
I'm thinking if there's anything recently that's come out. I'm thinking if there's anything in the new textbook on competition.
Yeah, I wrote a little bit about competition there. And
I remember there being something that I thought was good, so that's probably it. What?
Pardon? I'm stressing there that it's an aspect of capitalism that you shouldn't despair. It's not a negative, it's a positive of the system, that there's competition, if you understand it as a competition to get better and better. So look at Onkar's treatment of it in a new textbook on Americanism by Ayn Rand, edited by Jonathan Honig. This is Ayn Rand answered a series of questions, or wrote a series of questions that she intended to answer as part of giving a kind of introduction to Americanism, and she answered a bunch of them but didn't finish it. And so the new edition that includes all her answers to the questions she answered, and then other people answering or commenting on some of the other questions. I have something in there, and Onkar has something in there, and his deals with competition, as he was saying, and might help you place competition relative to these other concepts. There's also, if you look up competition in the Ayn Rand lexicon online, you'll find a number of discussions of it, including in America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business. So that's one place to put it. Other questions we're getting now? Gordon asks, if a man says it's the right thing to do, is he being intrinsicist or subjectivist? Well, I don't think he's being subjectivist unless he says it's right because I feel it's right or something like that. He might be being intrinsicist, or he might be being objectivist, depending on his reasons for thinking it's the right thing to do. If he says it's just the right thing to do, and there's nothing to be said about why it's the right thing to do, some things are just right and there's no reason for that other than their inherent rightness, then he's being an intrinsicist. Being objective involves kind of taking responsibility for your judgments of rightness or wrongness, that they're your judgments that you're making for a reason, and you can then say what that reason is. I think one other point about the subjective, intrinsic, objective distinction that Rand makes here, I think is important. We sort of touched on this, but I think, so I touched on it from this aspect, that she's arguing that the objective theory embodies in the whole pursuit of values and the whole activity of a valuer, as you were talking about, Greg, that it requires an active evaluation, which is a form of knowledge on this. And that's why to introduce force destroys this whole process. And yet this process is crucial for understanding the pursuit of one's own interest and happiness in an economic system of capitalism. But she's making another point about force that I think is very important and underappreciated outside of objectivist circles, which is she thinks of the other theories as saying that making force morally legitimate and often required. So it's not, so there's a perspective one can have is, well, everybody knows that force is bad, and when someone comes around and punches you in the nose and takes your wallet, like, who thinks that's good? And everybody thinks that's bad. But there's another perspective when one's thinking of a whole social system and organization that says that the use of force is good, often mandatory. And so just a couple of her formulations what she writes. this is first talking about the intrinsic approach. If he believes that the beneficiaries of such actions are irrelevant or interchangeable, he will regard wholesale slaughter as his moral duty in the service of a higher good, and higher in scare quotes. And that it's important that it's his moral duty, it's in service of a higher good that he's using force. And then for the subjectivist, if the subjectivist wants to pursue some social ideal of his own, he feels morally entitled to force men for their own good, since he feels that he is right and that there is nothing to oppose him but their misguided feelings. Close quote. So they're both giving a positive moral sanction to the use of force. And this, I think, is part of why she's raising it. And it's the exact opposite. The one says force has to be barred, and the other approaches say, no, force has to often be used in pursuit of the good.
Okay, well, I think that we're pretty much coming to an end. If there are no last thoughts or questions anyone wants to raise, we'll see you guys on Thursday to finish talking about what is capitalism, and we're going to focus more on the kind of economic side of it there. Then on Tuesday, we're going to dig into some of Rand's articles on property rights, and that'll get us a lot further into some of the questions that were coming up earlier today about the objective character of these rights and so forth. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you on Thursday.